The panel, which will be moderated by Joanna van der Merwe, who's a privacy and protection lead at the Center for Innovation, Leiden University, and non-resident fellow of the Defense Tech Initiative at CEPA. Joanna, I invite you to the stage.
Hi, good morning. I'd like to welcome everybody to our panel today, including those who are joining us online. My name is Joanna van der Merwe, and like he said, I'm actually a senior policy advisor now at the Leiden University. And I'd like to welcome, we have 4 brilliant panelists who'll be joining us here today to talk about how do we build resilient societies in the digital era with a specific focus on the cyber threats. And first I'd like to welcome to the stage Ms. Lucinda Creighton, who is a senior fellow with the Digital Innovation Initiative at CEPA, and was previously the former Minister for European Affairs at Eivind. She also works very closely with the Extremism Project, so we'll have some interesting discussion about that. Next, I'd like to invite Minister of Defense Hanno Pevkur from Estonia, who has previously also been Minister of Social Affairs, Minister of Justice, and Minister of Interior, so a full-rounded, holistic approach to this matter. Next, Mr. Eivind Petersson, State Secretary to the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs, who's previously also been a foreign defense and political advisor, as well as worked as a diplomat at various Norwegian embassies. And finally, once again, Mr. Karan Bhatia, please join us back up on the stage to delve a little bit more deeper into what you opened for us. So, as you know, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February highlighted the importance of military preparedness, but it's also revealed the need to be prepared to respond to actions in a holistic way. Digital technologies have increased the breadth of what needs to be responded to in these situations, with tech enabling Russia to reach beyond just Ukraine, but also carry out disinformation campaigns in NATO member states and throughout the world, as well as cyber attacks in countries that are not actively in the war. So I'd like to start maybe with looking at, you highlighted how you've been supporting Ukraine, Mr. Bhatia, but I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into what Google has done to support the response to Russia and support and how the sanctions have impacted the way you do work and how you've supported those sanctions and changed your business for that.
Great, thank you very much. So yes, to dive in a little bit deeper into some of the things I quickly alluded to. So again, at the beginning of the war, as literally in the hours following, we basically launched an all-of-company effort to sort of identify what the key results, what the impacts were likely to be on us, and what were the steps that we needed to take, recognizing that this was really an unprecedented situation. And so 4 main work streams coming out of that. The first was, and I alluded to each of these briefly, but just to dive into it, the first was focusing on helping the people immediately on the ground in Ukraine. We recognized that there were going to be some amount of chaos, effectively, as you had people desperate to figure out what was going on, how to be safe, for those who needed to escape, how they could do so safely, where they could turn, where there were missing loved ones, how to actually connect with them. So the first thing we did was immediately stand up, which is our bread and butter. We know how to get information out to people. And so, but we needed to do so in local languages. And the real challenge is getting the most authoritative information. So just quickly on escape routes, it was very unclear to begin with whether these routes that were being marked, were in fact being protected or not, to what extent they were safe or not. So it involved a great deal of collaboration with the Red Cross, with government agencies, and so forth to forget. So one significant body of work, simply getting information. The second was, from the very beginning, we recognized that this was going to be a war fought like no other war in terms of the threat of disinformation. And we saw that early on. We saw everything on our sites from simply claims that there was no war, there was no invasion, there was nothing going on, don't look here, to claims about the Ukrainian government being Nazis, this being coordinated by American or European government officials, whatever it was. And so we recognized that there was a new threat and very quickly moved in advance of sanctions, you referenced sanctions there, to take actions to deal with the disinformation challenge along the lines of what I had alluded to, removing state-sponsored media, shutting down ads, et cetera. I would note that that disinformation challenge has continued, it has evolved, it has become very targeted around different regions of the world. The messages have varied based on where the targets are. There's segmentation on it. So it's an ongoing challenge that needs to be addressed. The third area was cybersecurity, where we saw, I think there was an initial concern about simply takedowns of entire bits of critical infrastructure. We were obviously watching for that, but we were also watching for DDoS attacks. We were watching for the kinds of other things that one sees. We have what we call a threat assessment group that conducts those reviews. We were undertaking those on an hourly basis, sharing that information with relevant government authorities. And then the last, obviously, was the humanitarian efforts that I referenced before, that from a very early sign, it was clear that we, along with many other companies, were going to need to significantly step up our acts in those regard.
Minister of Defense Pevkur, Mr. Bhatia has referenced the working relationship that had to be established with various partners. Yesterday, you were on a panel and you discussed the exercises that Estonia has been undertaking to practice responding to such crises. I'm wondering what the relationship looks like in those exercises between these tech companies that play such a vital role and obviously your public sector bodies, and what does that relationship look like, and what lessons did you learn from those exercises, and how are you developing that relationship, especially in light of lessons that are being learned in Ukraine?
Well, good morning. First of all, we have to go back in time, about 15 years. So when we go back to 2007, this was basically the first cyber attack, large-scale cyber attack to any country. The Russians then attacked Estonia, and then what we did that time was that, yes, we are lucky that we are a small country, that we were able to close basically all the lines into Estonia, and then we started to open bit by bit the gates again, and this was very simplified approach how we dealt that time with the Russian cyber attack towards Estonia. But now also giving or taking these lessons, what we saw then, we created a new system, or not a system, but new approach that in our defense league, which is a voluntary unit in our defense system, basically we've created also, or actually it was an initiative from the private sector, to create cyber defense league, which means that those people who are involved in this kind of activities, they are still working somewhere in the companies as tech leaders or heads of IT or specific experts. And when there is a need, or if there is a need, then they will join our state experts, and we will basically make a joint task group immediately how to tackle these attacks. And this is a very good example, how you can engage the private sector towards to the attacks. Now, when we take Ukraine, then I must say for the beginning that Ukraine has been extremely successful in Stratcom. And part of that Stratcom is definitely also the digital approach, what they did, what kind of messages they are giving out, what kind of videos they are uploading to increase the defense will, and all that kind of activities. And I'm very happy to see, as we have had very good cooperation with Ukrainians throughout the years, and we also shared our experience from 2007, then they were able to prepare themselves for such kind of war and such kind of attacks, what they see at the moment in Ukraine. And definitely the Defense League, or the Cyber Defense League, what we told them is one of the approaches. So also in Ukraine, we see that many private sector companies and also experts are helping at the moment in military to tackle with the cyber attacks, because cyber attacks can be very different. We heard the DDoS, but DDoS is just one of the easiest attacks. You can see also hybrid attacks in cyber sphere. So you can see that they will publish decision makers' phones just to give people just overload of the calls. You see fake news. You see falsificated acts or papers. So it's like wide range of possibilities. But what we have to understand is that, you know, probably alone the government sector cannot tackle all these challenges.
Thank you, and I think that leads really well into a question I have for Mr. Petersson. We know that in hybrid war, we're facing a lot of threat vectors, crossover between different ones. And I was wondering, how do you view the intersection of cybersecurity and energy security given Russia's threats in both spaces? We've seen Nord Stream 2. We know that the Baltic pipeline also had to pay attention to security issues recently. What is the crossover between those two? And if anybody wants to jump in, I see Mr. Bhatia already nodding. If you want to jump in to add on at the end, please feel free.
No, thank you. The two are obviously connected. A few years back, we had the example in the US of foreign hackers managing to infiltrate US companies in charge of a significant portion of the US electric grid. So obviously, cybersecurity, energy security have been connected for a number of years. It is a paradox, however, I believe, bearing in mind the images we saw in the Baltic Sea a few days ago, that whoever is responsible, there are more cost-effective ways of achieving the same aim, using cybersecurity, cyber tools, which again leads me to the preliminary conclusion that a major motivation of whoever is responsible was the symbolism. We've seen the images of the methane gas literally bubbling up, and with the consequences it has had for increased worries, fear across Europe. We have, of course, taken our side of the responsibility as now Europe's largest gas provider. Norwegian companies from the Norwegian shelf, 8,800 kilometers of pipelines to Europe. On the kinetic side, on the military side, with the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Home Guard, and a number of other visible and non-visible measures. But I come back to the simple fact that there are easier way of achieving the same aims, which again leads me to the preliminary conclusion that what happened there could have many motivations, one of them being us to worry about different things, steering our attention away from, for example, what's happening in Ukraine. But coming back again to the connection energy cybersecurity, my experience from the past week is that I'm not complacent at all, but from energy companies, they are much more used to this than to the threat posed by what we saw in the Baltic Sea. This was not a whole new world, but linking up with the military side, with the government agencies on that side, was not something that they were that used to. Handling cybersecurity threats, they are certainly used to. If you're a big company, this is something you deal with on a daily basis. So not complacency whatsoever, but luckily the companies have significant experience and expertise in how to handle this.
Just to follow up on that, has there been any change in threat perception as I know that Russia conducted some of these attacks on energy infrastructure after the 2014 annexation of Crimea? Has there been any change in threat perception based off of the change in the way, in the level of belligerence that Russia is willing to go to at this stage? You know, we're hearing them say we're going to possibly use nuclear weapons. Has there been any change in the threat perception of what Russia would be willing to do using cyber means in Europe or specifically in Norway as one of the main providers of energy security for Europe in this situation?
Keeping a cool head and taking the threat seriously, the answer nonetheless obviously would have to be yes. And it's also clear bearing in mind, I mean, just the cost analysis of analyzing the costs of if you want to create harm, that's one of the most cost-effective way of doing things is to attack through on the digital side. So certainly, after what we saw in the Baltic Sea, threat perception has changed somewhat, and measures have been taken.
So you've mentioned, each of you touched upon in some of your answers, the discussion around disinformation, misinformation. Ms. Creighton, I'd like to talk to you a bit about a topic that maybe not being high on the agenda, but are you worried about fomenting extremism that from the Ukrainian war and what that means for misinformation, disinformation we're seeing online, and whether we have that is causing a concern that is not being taken seriously enough yet?
Yes, is the short answer. So I think, firstly, I think it's fair to say that the large tech companies have responded, as indeed have governments around the world, in terms of the immediate action of banning, RT and specific state-sponsored media outlets, and that was very swift and immediate, and I think had an important and positive effect. I suppose what's much more difficult and intangible are the multiple millions of social media accounts and different platforms where the Russian state, long before February 2022, has been building a really effective and very sophisticated disinformation presence across technology platforms, and I think that is something that has been having and continues to have a profound impact across the world, and I think particularly with a geographical focus on Europe, and that's something that the European Commission, governments across the West are very conscious of and have attempted to respond to, but it's very difficult and has, I suppose, met with mixed results, and that obviously is a heightened threat and a heightened risk since the invasion of Ukraine. I think when you look at Ukraine, so the risk here is, I suppose, you have the theatre of war, you have an attractive destination for far right and far left extremists, both of whom have travelled to Ukraine and have participated on both sides, actually, which is interesting, and across the ideological spectrum as well. And in a sense, it doesn't often matter to some of these far right extremists or far left extremists with whom they're aligning. So there's a huge groundswell, if you like, of extremist propaganda fueled by the conflict in Ukraine, and that has not just happened since February. It's been the case going back to 2014. We have seen recruitment campaigns online, radicalization to some extent online, and we've seen individuals now. I think it's estimated about 20,000 potential foreign fighters had declared their interest in travelling to Ukraine, most of whom would have been coordinated or inspired online through online propaganda campaigns. In reality, that number hasn't travelled to the theatre of war. It's much closer to, I think, around maybe 1,000 since February. So it's much smaller actually than the period from 2014 onwards, when about 17,000 Western foreign fighters travelled to Ukraine to participate primarily with pro-Russian forces. So it's a threat, it's a risk. I think we've learned a lot in terms of how to deal with radicalization and recruitment, in the context of extremist content online, and indeed terrorist content online, which emanated from the wars in Syria and Iraq. And I think some of the lessons that have been learned in those contexts now need to be applied in terms of evaluating and assessing the risk and the threat from the war in Ukraine, and the risk of potential violence down the road. Perhaps not immediately, but certainly it's something that policymakers and legislators need to be really, really aware of.
And from your viewpoint, would you say that that reaction from the tech companies, that swift reaction at the beginning, was a result of having learned lessons from other areas where we saw this online propaganda? And would you have seen them do more, or do you think it was enough of what they were capable of?
I mean, I think not just in the context of the war in Ukraine, but if you look at elections on both sides of the Atlantic, I think a huge amount of pressure has come to bear on particularly the large tech platforms to respond, to be more responsible, to be more transparent in terms of how they actually address the big, significant problem of illegal content online. That pressure it's moral pressure, it's pressure coming from sponsors, it's pressure coming from policymakers. It's also materializing now in the form of regulation and legislation. So we've seen in the European Union in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen the terrorist content online regulation, which puts significant responsibility and burden on tech platforms, and of course recently agreed and finalized the Digital Services Act, which again imposes really significant obligations on tech platforms around disclosing revenues from advertising, transparency around political messaging, and also, of course, requirements around the removal of extremist, illegal content and terrorist content. So a lot is happening, both from a sort of a voluntary perspective, but also from the point of view of regulation, which is obliging tech companies to respond. And I think from a reputational point of view, I think they really do want to be seen to do it, and increasingly that is the case. And I think that's partly, why we saw a fairly rapid response when it came to the invasion of Ukraine in February.
You mentioned the different laws coming out, governance structures. Mr. Bhatia, I'd like to talk to you maybe a bit about, we've got European views and the US views here, and we know that there is a move to create a more transatlantic approach to how we govern tech and the different regulations. Do you... we know that the European Union has been imposing stronger and stronger regulations. How do you view those regulations and the possible divide across the Atlantic on the ability to build truly digitally resilient societies, but also partnerships between the two?
It's a terrific point and very timely, given some of the things Lucinda and others sort of referenced. If I could just maybe comment very quickly, though, on the last point, which I think that, from my vantage point, one of the most interesting things to see having in the Ukraine context was how tech companies, or at least I can speak for Google, reacted as quickly as we did. I think it was in part due to what we had learned before from the experiences in Syria and Iraq and so forth. But I also think that there was, on some of these, there wasn't regulation. The sanctions and things had not yet kicked in to sort of dictate outcomes on the disinformation side. What I saw that was impressive was just the degree of informal, immediate coordination that was happening. So in a certain sense, it's a question of, this was outside of regulation. This was, now it may have been reputational concerns. It may be that, as in our case, you just didn't want to have disinformation on your platform. It is not the kind of platform, it's not what you want as you're looking to build the business. But what allowed the action to happen was actually a level of informal, practical coordination. People on the phone sort of saying, what about this? What about that? What about this? That, in fact, I think was an incredible model and something that we've learned from this, so that maybe to the point the minister was making, it's actually a partnership that we really need to have take this stuff on. It's no amount of regulation is going to sort of yield that result at the end of the day. It really has to be done through that level of coordination. On the point that you were making about transatlantic, yeah, I mean, look, from our vantage point, we have seen the last 10 years, unfortunately, be a period where we've actually seen less and less coordination, I would say, to some extent divergence, to some extent it's just been two ships sort of going in different directions here between the United States and Europe. The US has, in some significant measures, simply not acted at all. We've been pushing, for instance, for stronger comprehensive privacy legislation in the United States. Europe obviously acted. But more broadly, if you look globally around the world, you're seeing a proliferation of regulation in a variety of different spaces, which even for a big company like Google becomes incredibly challenging to comply with. You know, if you are going to have to comply with 200 or 500 when you start dealing with national level privacy regulations or content regulations or whatever. It's not just a tax, it's really prohibitive for many to actually get into it. So thus the point that this, and I do think the Ukraine war is a little bit of impetus potentially for the two sides to start coming together. There's been the launch of the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, a terrific thing. We've urged it from the beginning. I'd say the results thus far are modest, good, but modest. There are much bigger things that need to be addressed, real coordination. And what is ultimately at stake, I would suggest on this, is if the US and Europe can't come together as the world's leading democracies in this space, the field is being entirely opened up to others to set the model or simply for there to be no alignment whatsoever. So hugely important topic.
Yeah, I mean, that leads to the question of if we don't come together, do we open ourselves up to not being able to compete with China and China's model of building digital technologies?
I mean, look, I think you see a variety of countries out there that are pushing less liberal, less democratic visions of the internet, frankly, not even a globally integrated internet. So yeah, I think that's certainly a threat. And then the other threat is just simply, you've got this explosion of divergent forms of regulation. There are elements of protectionism that work their way into these things. There are elements of, authoritarianism that sort of work their ways into these forms of regulation. So yes, I think the imperative is there.
So I'd like to take a bit of a futuristic look now and look at what we need to do, where we're going with building resiliency, cyber resiliency as we move forward, especially as the geopolitical situation is changing a bit. So I'd like to start off with Minister Pevkur. What do you see going forward for Estonia, one of the leading cyber countries in the world? I mean, I would say at the forefront of it. What do you see next for Estonia and how they're building their resiliency, and maybe what can the rest of us learn from your country?
Well, you can learn many things from Estonia for sure. Just come to visit us and we will show you. We don't have much time for that, so to go through all the details. But nevertheless, when I'm just trying to think about the future, so then first and foremost, resilience definitely is important. And our readiness to tackle all the challenges we have ahead of us. But just imagine for a moment what also the social media platforms, what role they play. Also, when we take that, what is the responsibility? For instance, let's imagine that there will be a video in Facebook circulating where the President of the United States declares nuclear bombing to Russia. It comes out that it's a deep fake, but as the deep fake is just, like evolving so rapidly that it's not so far away, and actually it's doable already today. And now, when we don't have the approval to that, so even when the approval comes in 10 minutes, then by that 10 minutes, it has been circulating all around the Facebook already to millions and millions of viewers. And we can only imagine the impact to the global markets, to the economy, to the financial markets, to the decision makers, etc. So just, I believe that deepfake is something we have to fight very, very heavily. In that matter, that it's a huge threat to the security of our people. And then this is the sad part of the story. The good part of the story is that tech industry is always inventing something new also for the military side. So even when I take my own Estonian companies like Vegvisir, who is producing the virtual reality glasses for instance, tanks. So basically, it's much more secure, and it will get more information to the operators. Or the Census Q, who is producing the intelligence gathering information from the battlefield. So that kind of new inventions will help on the battlefield a lot. But once again, when we take the technology, then we have to separate the civil side and the private sector and the military side. So it's, but on the other hand, both of the sides, especially the bad people, can use this technology against us. And especially in that sense, I truly believe that we have to be very, very careful with all these new gadgets, new things in the market. Or on the market. So it's a quite a big challenge for us to understand what is the fake news and what is the reality, and and also when I now bring also the third component, which is the real cyber attack to our different infrastructure objects, like power plants or whatever. Basically, everything is linked today. So when we take out and create the perfect storm in the energy sector, so then we all understand what that means to the societies. So it's a great challenge for all of us, but I believe that Estonia is one of the countries who is well prepared for that kind of attacks.
I'd like to open up to the floor if anybody has any questions in the last 10 minutes here. Are there any questions? There is a mic runner, I believe, today who will bring the microphone to you. We have one here at the front.
Thank you. My name is Greg Domber. I'm an American academic here in Poland on a Fulbright Fellowship for the year. My question is particularly to Google, but to everyone on the panel. With each passing day, the likelihood of Ukrainian victory seems more and more present. I think that's something we're all asking for and fighting for. So my question is about the day after the Ukrainian victory and how lessons from the past 7 months affect strategic thinking in terms of cyber threats, in terms of cyber response for the other panelists, but for Google in terms of investment. You spoke about investing in people and products. How has your thinking about engagement in the Russian sphere been shifted by the brutality, by the immorality, and by the actions of Russians and the Russian government in these past 7 months? Thank you.
I'm happy to take a quick stab at that. I'll talk about Russia, but let me talk about investment in Ukraine for a second as well, which is, I actually am very excited by, notwithstanding the fact that the Ukrainian government is dealing with this unbelievable challenge of the ongoing aggression, they continue to be focused on building a robust digital system for their government. And we've had the privilege of working with some of the Ukrainian government officials. Deputy Prime Minister Fedorov in particular has been a leader in sort of thinking through it. So it's a remarkably forward-sighted thought about how to construct a e-government system that in any event we're excited to be thinking about how to work with them on. I think with respect to Russia, look, the reality is that sanctions alone, I think, have made the prospect of ongoing economic engagement in Russia something that I don't think anybody is seriously thinking about. At least I will tell you, our business is there, is shut down. As I mentioned before, we've shut down our ads business. We actually had to declare bankruptcy because we were having our assets sold, or assets seized by the government. So honestly, there's not a lot of thinking, I think, going on about anything in the future there.
Well, very briefly about Ukraine. So trust me, every country at the moment is looking very closely what is happening in Ukraine and trying to take the lessons learned from there. And for sure, you know, the day after will be that one thing is theory, what we think, how everything is working, but the battlefield shows clearly how they work in reality. And you know, we have seen some, or we have taken already some of the lessons of that, you know, that you think that, or everybody had an understanding that Russia's army is very advanced and then we have some new gadgets on the battlefield. The reality was different. Yes, they are using some of the possibilities, but the reality still is that they are using the same methods as they used in the Second World War. So, but nevertheless, when we take the intelligence, when we take the possibilities for the information gathering with other means, like with a satellite or with some other equipment, then definitely for the battlefield and then for the lessons learned, this is something we have to look very carefully, and we will collect a lot of information from that, and we will do our conclusions from that, and we will implement or adapt our defense plans accordingly.
From my perspective, I think the lesson learned from this experience and the approach that must be adopted the day after, and I hope that your prognosis is correct, it is that there is no alternative to the transatlantic alliance. And the United States and Europe has to face these challenges collectively. I think, you know, we've seen in the past the pivot away, the pivot to Asia. In the United States, we saw in the last administration the European Union literally being deemed an enemy of the US. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I think we see more clearly now than we have probably for 60 or 70 years that Europe is absolutely essential to US security and vice versa. So I think that's a really important takeaway, and it goes to your point, Karan, around the TTC. We have to make that work. The results are very modest to date, but we have to make it work. And then the other point, I think, is when we look at security and defense, generally speaking, cybersecurity is core, it is fundamental. I think still we think in old-fashioned terms about security and defense spending. When we talk about contributions to NATO, we're thinking in terms of traditional expenditure, traditional infrastructure, and I think we have to change that attitude. And when we talk about forms, you know, the regulation and legislation that's happening in Europe around tech, at present, I think we have to have a greater input from, for example, cybersecurity agencies, national and European level and US. We have to actually listen to cybersecurity experts when we're framing this type of regulation to ensure that it is robust. And that's something that has shocked me actually in the last number of years as the DMA and DSA have evolved at European level, that actually cybersecurity experts and agencies have really not been part of the conversation at all. And I think that's something that we need to learn from.
We have a time for, I think, one more question. There's a lady at the back.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. I'm Anna from Portugal. I'm a former member of the Portuguese Parliament, lawyer, and a researcher in Cambridge University for defense and security issues. My question is for Google. Sorry, but I really want to know your politics in terms of fighting against misinformation. As a tool of research, very powerful, you passes an image of trust for the researchers that research on Google tool. So what will be your politics in terms of fighting and contribution in terms of fighting against misinformation? Because as a lawyer, I already tried to denunciate so many sites that are selling, for example, tickets, false tickets to concerts and things like that. And I don't know, I just want to know much more about that, because you will have you could have a very strong contribution to this problem. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. Look, as I mentioned before, I think the Ukraine war is maybe the most tangible example, but of the challenge of disinformation and misinformation in recent months. But it is a pervasive challenge. It exists not just in the context of Ukraine, and not just perpetrated by state-sponsored actors or by one government. We see, unfortunately, it growing. The elections that you referenced, I think, were an important wake-up call for a lot of technology companies in that regard, and I think there's an enormous amount of effort going into it. There are an array of ways that we try to tackle it and think about it. One is through the application of new and more technology to address the challenge. And one has to imagine the scale of the problem is almost unimaginable. You know, the hundreds of hours of video that get uploaded every second into major platforms. The fact that misinformation and disinformation is not happening just in the English language. It's happening in thousands of languages, and it's often incredibly subtle and being done with references and dog whistles and things that one doesn't fully appreciate. So one needs to invest in research to understand what the nature of the challenge is. One thing I will mention about Central and Eastern Europe specifically in the context of this is we announced a multi-million-dollar grant to invest just in this region on understanding how disinformation is being perpetrated. You know, what is the narrative that would work in any particular way? And then, of course, there is the array of tools that one has to use within the technology itself. So raising up authoritative information, taking out, reducing, adjusting the algorithms to eliminate misinformation and disinformation, utilizing business models to try and reward authoritative information. So it is a comprehensive approach to a huge challenge. There is no single solution. There's no company that's perfect at it, I will tell you, but it is among the top challenges that we think about.
So unfortunately, that brings our time to a close. I think, as you highlighted, when we're talking about digital resiliency and cyber threats and opportunities, we could talk for hours because it is all-encompassing and it is a massive challenge we face going forward. I'd like to thank each of the panelists for joining us today. Very interesting conversation and brilliant insights. Maybe I'll come visit Estonia so that I can learn a bit more about it from you. And thank you to the audience and the people who have submitted their questions.